A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Herman, I was thinking this morning about that feeling of absolute dread when a hard drive starts making that clicking sound. You know the one. It is that rhythmic mechanical ticking that basically says all your photos, all your documents, and all your work are about to vanish into the digital void. We live in this era where we are obsessed with redundancy. We have RAID arrays, we have cloud backups, we have geographically distributed servers. We are terrified of a single point of failure. It is the ultimate modern anxiety, the idea that our entire digital existence is held together by spinning platters and microscopic charges that could dissipate at any moment.
It is the ghost in the machine, corn. Every time I hear a server fan spin up a little too loud in the basement, I start thinking about my off-site backups and whether my synchronization scripts actually ran last night. But you are right, the stakes feel uniquely modern because our data feels so fragile. We think of information as this ephemeral thing that can be wiped out by a single solar flare, a bad line of code, or just a bit of magnetic decay. Herman Poppleberry here, by the way, and I think we often forget that this anxiety is not actually new. It is just the medium that changed. The fear of losing the collective memory of a species is as old as the first person who realized that a story told to a child might be forgotten by the grandchild.
And that is what our housemate Daniel was poking at with the prompt he sent us today. He wanted us to look at how this modern concept of node-based distribution and redundancy actually has these deep, ancient roots. He was asking how people in the ancient world, who are dealing with literal book burnings and the physical destruction of their history, managed to create their own versions of distributed systems. It is fascinating because today we talk about IPFS, or decentralized ledgers, but for 3,000 years, the only way to keep an idea alive was a very manual, very human version of that same architecture. We are talking about a world where the delete command was a torch, and the backup drive was a monk with a very tired hand.
I love that Daniel brought this up because it shifts the perspective from technology to strategy. When we talk about redundancy today, we are usually talking about hardware and automated protocols. But in the ancient world, redundancy was an act of will. It was a political and cultural strategy. If you were a scholar in the Mediterranean 2,000 years ago, your threat model was not a hard drive crash or a corrupted file system. It was a literal fire or a conquering army that wanted to erase your entire culture from the record. The term is damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. It was the ultimate delete command. And the only way to counter it was to make sure your data was sitting in as many different physical nodes as possible before the sensors showed up at your door.
It really makes you wonder if a distributed network is still a network, if the latency is measured in years instead of milliseconds. I mean, if I send a copy of a manuscript from Alexandria to Rome by boat, that is a data transfer. It is just a very slow one, but the logic is identical to what we do now. So today we are diving into ancient redundancy. How did they handle data corruption without automated tools? How did they ensure the integrity of the information across thousands of miles? And what can we learn from them about building systems that actually last centuries instead of just years? Because let us be honest, Herman, your cloud subscription probably won't last as long as a well-placed clay jar.
It is a massive topic. We usually think of the Library of Alexandria as this one tragic point of failure, right? The fire happens and all human knowledge is lost. But that is actually a bit of a misconception. The real story of how knowledge survived is much more decentralized. The Library of Alexandria was more like a central hub or a primary data center, but the nodes were the copies sent to other Mediterranean cities like Rhodes, Pergamum, or Rome. The fire was a massive blow to the network, but it was not a total system failure because the data had already been cached elsewhere. The real story of how knowledge survived is a story of monasteries, private collections, and trade routes acting as a massive, low-speed distributed network.
Let us start there, with the actual mechanics of the ancient data center. When I think of a data center today, I think of racks of servers in a climate-controlled room with halon fire suppression systems. But for a long time, the data center was the scriptorium. Herman, you have spent a lot of time looking at the monastic protocols. How did they actually function as a replication system?
The scriptorium was essentially a manual replication node. If you look at the Benedictine monks, for example, their entire lifestyle was built around the preservation and copying of texts. It was not just a religious exercise, it was a protocol for data integrity. The Benedictine rule actually mandated specific hours for reading and manual labor, which included copying manuscripts. Think about the physical act of copying a manuscript. It is a high latency, high effort process, but it was built on a very specific set of rules to prevent errors. They had a master copy and a working copy. They had readers who would check the work of the scribes. It was a multi-stage verification process.
Right, because if one monk makes a typo, and then the next monk copies that typo, you have a classic case of data corruption. In modern systems, we use checksums or hashing to make sure the file you downloaded is exactly the same as the source. How did a monk in the year 800 do that?
They actually had a version of a checksum, believe it or not. They used something called a colophon. At the end of a manuscript, the scribe would often write a note. Sometimes it was just a complaint about how much their hand hurt or a request for a drink, but often it included metadata. It would say who wrote it, when, where, and what source text they were using. It was a way of establishing the provenance of the data, and more importantly, they would often perform a count of the lines or even the individual letters. If the count did not match the original, they knew the copy was corrupted. They were essentially doing a manual bit count at the end of every files they created.
That is incredible. So they were performing manual error correction, but the real power was not just in the accuracy of the single copy, it was in the distribution. If you have 10 monasteries across Europe, and each one has a copy of a specific text, you have effectively eliminated the single point of failure. If the Vikings raid one monastery and burn the library, the data still exists in the other 9 nodes. It is a classic N+1 redundancy strategy, just with more chainmail and fewer fiber optic cables.
And this is where the geographic diversity comes in. One of the fundamental rules of modern backup strategy is that you do not keep all your backups in the same building. You want them in different power grids, different seismic zones, and different political jurisdictions. The ancient world understood this implicitly. Knowledge that stayed in one place died. Knowledge that traveled survived. Think about the Greek texts. A lot of what we have today survived because it was translated into Arabic and housed in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad or kept in the Byzantine Empire, while Western Europe was going through a period of relative instability.
That is a perfect example of node failure and recovery. The Western European nodes went offline for a few centuries, but the data was cached in the Middle Eastern nodes. The House of Wisdom was not just a library, it was a translation hub that acted as a cross-platform data migration service. They were taking Greek codes and porting it to Arabic, which ensured it could run on a different cultural operating system. Then, during the Renaissance, that data was effectively resynced back into the European network. It is a massive, multi-century data recovery operation, but it only worked because the data had been distributed across different cultures and geographies.
And it was not just about accidental loss like fires or raids. It was about intentional deletion. You mentioned damnatio memoriae earlier. In the Roman world, if an emperor was particularly hated after he died, the Senate would literally try to erase him from history. They would scratch his name off monuments, melt down his statues, and burn any records of his reign. It was a centralized attempt to wipe a record from the database. The only way to fight that was to have decentralized, private nodes that the government could not reach. Private citizens would hide scrolls in their villas. It was the ancient version of a hidden folder or an encrypted drive.
It is like the early days of the internet where people would mirror websites that were being censored. If one node goes down, 3 more pop up. But in the ancient world, your node might be a private library in a villa in Pompeii or a hidden scroll in a cave. Which brings us to one of the coolest examples of cold storage I can think of, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, absolutely. The Essenes, who lived out by the Dead Sea not too far from where we are now in Jerusalem, were essentially the ultimate preppers of the information world. They saw the Roman crackdown coming. They knew the central node, the temple, and the city of Jerusalem was at high risk of a total system failure. So what did they do? They created an air-gapped offline backup. They took their most critical data, their religious and communal texts, and they moved it to a low-access frequency node.
I love the term air-gapped for a bunch of clay jars in a cave, but that is exactly what it was. They put it in a place where no one would look, in a climate that was naturally suited for long-term preservation. They were not trying to distribute it for daily use. They were trying to ensure its survival in the event of a total network collapse. They used clay jars as ruggedized enclosures to protect the hardware, the parchment, from environmental degradation.
And it worked! Those scrolls sat in those caves for 2,000 years. The central nodes were destroyed, the people were dispersed, the language even changed, but the data remained bit perfect in that cave until it was rediscovered in the 1940s. That is the ultimate success story for a backup system. It survived a 2,000-year outage. It is the definition of cold storage. You do not touch it for centuries, but when you finally mount the drive, the data is still there.
It also highlights something we talked about in episode 771 about the high stakes of critical redundancy. If the Essenes had not done that, our understanding of that entire period of history would be a massive blank space. But because they understood the concept of a cold storage node, the data survived the collapse of the society that created it. It is a reminder that the most important data often needs the most extreme isolation.
There is also this concept of the social hash that I find fascinating. How do you trust the data when it finally resurfaces? In the ancient world, the reputation of the institution or the scribe acted as the validation. If a manuscript came from a well-known monastery with a strict scriptorium protocol, it was considered more reliable. It is almost like a digital signature. You are verifying the source to ensure the integrity of the information. Scholars would compare different versions of a text from different nodes to find the consensus version. It is very similar to how a blockchain reaches consensus, or how ZFS handles data scrubbing by comparing mirrored copies to find the one that has not been corrupted.
So we have the hardware, which is the vellum or papyrus. We have the nodes, which are the monasteries and caves. And we have the protocols, which are the copying rules and the colophons. But what about the data format? Today, we have standardized formats like HTML or PDF to ensure that any computer can read the file. Did the ancient world have a version of that?
They absolutely did, and this is one of my favorite deep-cut history facts. Around the year 780 during the reign of Charlemagne, there was a massive push for what we now call the Carolingian minuscule. At the time, every region in Europe had its own messy, barely legible handwriting. If a monk in France sent a book to a monk in Germany, the German monk might not be able to read it. It was like trying to open a Mac file on a DOS machine in the 80s. The encoding was all wrong.
So, it was a compatibility issue. The network was fragmented because the data formats were not standardized. You could have the physical book, but if you could not decode the script, the information was effectively encrypted without a key.
Charlemagne realized that if he wanted to run a cohesive empire and preserve knowledge, he needed a standard, so they developed the Carolingian minuscule. It was a clear, uniform script with lowercase letters, spaces between words, and punctuation. It sounds basic to us now, but it was a revolutionary data format. It ensured that any node in the empire could read any message or book produced by any other node. It was the UTF-8 of the Middle Ages. It created a universal read capability across the entire network.
That is a great analogy. Without a standardized script, the redundancy is useless. You could have 1,000 copies of a book, but if nobody can decode the characters, the data is lost anyway. The Carolingian minuscule was the key that unlocked the entire network. It made the data interoperable.
And it is why so many of the classical texts we have today are in that specific script. When the Renaissance scholars were looking for ancient Roman texts, they often found Carolingian copies from the 9th century and thought they were the originals because the script was so much more readable than the messy medieval scripts that came later. It was a format that was so successful it actually disguised its own age.
It is interesting to see how the need for redundancy actually drove the evolution of language and writing itself. We often think of these things as organic, but they were often intentional engineering decisions to make the network more robust. But let us talk about the second-order effects of this. If we only have what was redundant enough to survive, what are we missing?
That is the survivorship bias problem. It is the dark side of ancient redundancy. We do not have a complete record of history. We have a record of what was copied most often and stored in the safest places. The popular texts, the religious texts, the state-sponsored histories, those had the most nodes. The fringe ideas, the dissenting opinions, the scientific theories that were ahead of their time, those often had very few nodes. If they were not part of the active replication protocol, they were much more likely to be lost when a single node failed. We have lost about 99% of ancient Greek literature. We have 7 plays by Sophocles out of over 120. We have lost almost everything by Sappho.
It is like the modern internet. Popular content gets mirrored everywhere. It is on YouTube, it is on Twitter, it is on 1,000 personal hard drives. But a niche academic paper or a specific piece of open source code might only exist on 1 or 2 servers. If those servers go dark, that information is gone. The ancient world was just a much more extreme version of that. The popularity of a text was its primary survival mechanism. If it was not trending in the monasteries, it did not get backed up.
Right. And that brings up the palimpsest technique, which is basically the ancient version of overwriting a sector on a hard drive. Vellum, which is made from animal skin, was incredibly expensive and labor-intensive to produce. If a monastery ran out of blank vellum, they would take an old manuscript, scrape off the ink, and write over it. They were literally deleting old data to make room for new data because the storage media was so scarce.
So they were performing a low-level format on the vellum. That is terrifying from a preservation standpoint. You could be overwriting a lost work of Aristotle with a grocery list or a basic prayer book.
It happened all the time. But modern technology, like multispectral imaging, is actually allowing us to read the original text underneath. It is like using data recovery software to find deleted files on a hard drive. We have found lost works of Archimedes and Cicero hidden under medieval prayer books. The Archimedes palimpsest is the most famous example. It contained a unique work called The Method of Mechanical Theorems that was overwritten in the 13th century. It shows that even when they tried to delete the data, the physical medium sometimes held on to a ghost of it. The magnetic remnants of the ink stayed in the fibers of the vellum.
That is a perfect transition to the modern comparison. We keep talking about these ancient methods as if they are just metaphors for what we do now, but in some ways, they are actually more robust. If I write something on a piece of high-quality vellum and put it in a dry cave, it can last 2,000 years. If I put that same information on a USB drive and put it in a drawer, it might be unreadable in 20 years due to bit rot or connector oxidation.
This is the digital dark age problem we have discussed before. Our current storage media are incredibly high density but incredibly low longevity. We are building these massive distributed systems, but the individual nodes are very fragile. An SSD is a miracle of engineering, but it is not a long-term storage solution. The ancient world had the opposite problem. Their nodes were incredibly durable, stone, clay, vellum, but their replication process was incredibly slow and expensive. They had high durability but low throughput. We have high throughput but low durability.
Which is why something like IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, is so interesting. It is trying to bridge that gap. In IPFS, you are not looking for a file at a specific location, like a specific server address. You are looking for the content itself. If anyone on the network has a copy of that content, they can serve it to you. It is content addressing rather than location. Addressing.
And that is exactly how a scholar in the ancient world would have thought. They did not care if the copy of Homer came from the library in Ephesus or the library in Rhodes. They just cared that it was the Iliad. The content was the address. The physical book was just the carrier. When we talk about node-based distribution today, we are often just trying to replicate that ancient sense of permanence using digital tools. We are trying to make the where irrelevant so the what can survive.
We actually covered this in episode 636, comparing IPFS to the traditional cloud. The cloud is centralized. It is like the Library of Alexandria before it burned. If the central provider goes down, or decides to delete your account, you lose everything. IPFS is more like the monastic network. The data lives wherever someone chooses to host it. It is much harder to kill because there is no center to attack. You would have to burn down every monastery on the internet to delete the file.
And that is the key lesson for anyone worried about censorship or systemic collapse. Centralization is efficiency. but decentralization is survival. If you are a regime that wants to control information, you love centralization. You want one big library, one big internet gateway, one big social media platform. It makes the delete command very easy to execute. But if you are someone trying to preserve an idea against that regime, you have to be a node builder. You have to distribute the data. You have to make the cost of deletion higher than the cost of preservation.
You see this in modern geopolitical conflicts too. When there is an uprising or a war, one of the first things that happens is the internet gets shut down or filtered. People immediately revert to ancient redundancy tactics. They use mesh networks. They pass around physical thumb drives. They print things out. They're creating a physical, node-based distribution network because the centralized digital one has failed. They are becoming the modern equivalent of the traveling scholars who carried manuscripts under their robes.
It is the human protocol. At the end of the day, all redundancy relies on someone caring enough to make the copy. In the ancient world, that was driven by religious devotion, a passion for philosophy, or the need for administrative continuity. Today, it is often driven by automated scripts. But the automation can make us lazy. We assume the data is safe because it is in the cloud, but we do not always verify the integrity or the geographic diversity of that cloud. We have outsourced our will to preserve to a corporation's terms of service.
That is a great point. Just because your data is on 3 different servers does not mean it is redundant if all 3 of those servers are owned by the same company and sitting in the same data center in Northern Virginia. That is not a distributed system. That is just a very expensive single point of failure. If that company goes bankrupt or that region has a power grid failure, your redundancies vanishes.
Right. True redundancy requires diversity of jurisdiction and medium. If you really want to protect your data, you should have it in the cloud, on a local hard drive, and maybe even a physical copy of the most critical parts. You want to be like the Essenes. You want a cold storage backup that does not depend on the grid or a specific company staying in business. You want something that can survive a system outage that lasts longer than a weekend.
So, looking back at the ancient world, what are the big takeaways for us today? If someone is listening to this and thinking about their own personal archive, or even how we as a society protect our collective memory, what should they be doing?
The first big lesson is that geographic diversity is non-negotiable. 100 copies in one city is just one big target. You need your data to be where you are not. If you live in a place that is prone to natural disasters or political instability, your primary backup should be in a completely different part of the world. Use different providers, different countries, and different legal systems.
And the second lesson is the importance of the human protocol. We need to be active participants in our own data preservation. Do not just trust the defaults. Audit your backups. Make sure your most important photos and documents are in a format that is likely to be readable in 50 years. Avoid proprietary formats that might go extinct. Use the digital equivalent of the Carolingian minuscule. Standardized open formats like plain text, CSV, or open source image formats. If the software required to read your file requires a subscription that might not exist in 2026, your data is already at risk.
And finally, think about the longevity of the medium. We are so focused on the speed of access that we forget about the speed of decay. Sometimes, for the really important stuff, the old ways are still the best. There is a reason we still have the Magna Carta, but we have lost millions of emails from the 1990s. Physicality has a robustness that digitality struggles to match. If you have a document that absolutely must survive for your grandchildren, print it on acid-free paper or etch it into something stable. Don't just leave it on a server and hope for the best.
It is a bit ironic, right? We're the most information-rich civilization in history, yet we might be the most fragile. If the power went out tomorrow and stayed out, how much of our history would survive? Our stone monuments would still be there, but our entire digital soul could vanish in a generation. We are living in a house of cards built on silicon, while the ancients were building on granite.
It is a sobering thought. It makes you realize that the monks and the scribes were not just being tedious. They were the frontline soldiers in a war against entropy. They understood that information is constantly trying to disappear, and the only way to stop it is to keep moving it, keep copying it, and keep distributing it. They were the original network engineers, and their uptime was measured in centuries.
I think that is a perfect place to wrap up the main discussion. It really changes how you look at a simple copy-paste command. You're participating in a tradition that goes back to the first person who decided to write a story on 2 different clay tablets instead of 1. Every time you sync your phone or back up your laptop, you are performing a ritual of survival that has been keeping human culture alive since the Bronze Age.
It is the fundamental act of defiance against the fragility of time. We are all just nodes in a very long, very slow network.
Well, before we finish up, I want to take a second to remind everyone that if you're finding these deep dives into the weird corners of history and technology useful, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. We have been doing this for over 1,000 episodes now, and those reviews are still the best way for new people to find the show. It genuinely helps us out a lot. It is our own form of social redundancy. The more reviews we have, the more nodes we reach.
It really does. And if you want to check out some of the other episodes we mentioned, like episode 636 on IPFS or episode 742 on the preservation of historical records, you can find the whole archive at myweirdprompts.com. There is a search bar there, and you can dive into any topic we have covered over the years. We have tried to make the website as robust as possible, but maybe we should look into those clay jars for the server room after all.
Also, a huge thanks to our housemate Daniel for sending this one in. It is always fun when he pushes us to look at the ancient origins of modern problems. It definitely made me appreciate my backup drive a little more today, even if it is not as cool as a clay jar in a cave. It is a good reminder that we are not just managing files, we are managing a legacy.
I still think we should get some clay jars for the basement. Corn. You never know when the next solar flare is coming. We could store the show transcripts in them.
Maybe we start with some high-quality vellum first and work our way up to the pottery. Anyway, thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We are here in Jerusalem, exploring the world one prompt at a time, and trying to make sure our own little node stays online.
Until next time, keep your data distributed and your nodes diverse. Don't let your history become a single point of failure.
See you in the next one. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Take care, everyone. Stay redundant.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.